Hey, welcome to part 3 of the deploy a Python web application from scratch. In this one, it's all about version control, which we're going to go into a lot more detail in just a moment. But my name's Justin. I'm going to be taking you through this entire series step by step. So if you missed the other parts, be sure to go back and check them out. They are in the links in the description below, as well as time codes. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. And before we go any further, if this was the first time you've ever had a web page of any kind deployed manually in this way, you need to take a moment and just savor that. It's like fantastic. I mean, not that many people can do this. And as you've seen, it does have some tricky parts to it, but it's also not that hard. It's definitely achievable at this point. So I think just little by little, taking every little step will get you towards more and more powerful systems, and you just need to stick with it. Sometimes it's really, really hard and you want to give up, but in this case, just stick with it, because then there's times like this where you're like, oh wow, anybody in the world can now access my web page. Now granted, it's a static web page and we want to improve that, and that's the point of this series, is to improve that. But before we can even introduce a web application versus just static HTML, we have to learn another technology. And this technology will become a critical tool that you'll use for pretty much all of your software. And that technology is Git, and it's called version control. We are going to be installing this in a moment. But before we do, let's actually address the need for something like Git. Now, if we actually look inside of our server and the index file, or index.debian and all that, if we actually look at this, we see that it's just a simple file. So in the past, you could use something called FTP, File Transfer Protocol, that you could essentially log in, much like we did with SSH, and just change this file directly. You wouldn't necessarily have to SSH in to change it. You could just use FTP and then drag and drop things in. Stuff like CyberDuck is a simple and easy way to do that, but there's many others. Now, FTP is still a great technology, and in many cases, there still is a use for it. Like, it's not a useless technology at this point. But the thing that FTP doesn't necessarily do is track changes of files over time. So let me just show you what I mean by that. I'm going to go ahead and copy this index file, the entire thing. Let's copy it from HTML to doc type, and let's go into a text editor of some kind. It really doesn't matter which one you're using at this point. So I'm just going to paste it in here. And so what I mean by file changes is, if I saved this, I'm going to just save it on my desktop, and I'll just call this deleteme.html. Okay, so eventually I'll delete it, but the idea here is, if I made a change, let's say for instance, you sent this over to a web designer, somebody who knows CSS really, really well, and they decided that they want the color to be red, okay? And they save that, they send it back to you, and you didn't actually receive the color being red, but instead you received the text color being green. And you weren't actually looking that closely at what happened. This is actually a problem, right? It's hard to verify that they made the correct changes. So what we need something that will track the changes in these files over time. And that's actually what Git does, is it tracks changes in files over time so that you can catch really little things like the color, but you can also catch much bigger things that aren't as obvious as green or red. And then further, you can then backtrack. So if you did make that big mistake and you actually put it into a live server, you need a way to actually be able to go backwards, and that's what Git does. It will allow you to say, oh, we're just going to omit that color altogether. And again, this is a really simple example of what potentially could happen. But the idea is we need this early on. And I'm sure you've heard of things like GitHub. Of course, this is our GitHub for Coding for Entrepreneurs. And then Linode has a GitHub. Like, everyone has a GitHub, right? There's so many out there. That is because we can now track these changes over time, and we do that using Git. So for those of you who already know Git and know it well, there are going to be some configuration things that are specific for what we're doing here. So if you don't have Git on your local machine, you definitely want to download it from git-scm.com. There is certainly one for Mac and Windows that's really easy. Just download, run that as you normally would with any sort of installation package. You might have to allow it from a security perspective to actually do it, but the idea is really simple. You just install that Git package, and then if you opened up a new terminal window or PowerShell, you could actually write out Git just like that, Git, and it will actually have all of that access as needed. So you're going to want to do that now, and then we're going to go ahead and come back and actually do all of the Git related configuration, as well as installing Git on our hosting server. Now is the time to actually set up our project. Now, when I say set up our project, I primarily mean Git, right? We need a folder and a place to store all of our project and use Git for tracking all of those file changes. Now, I recommend that you use Visual Studio Code, or VS Code for short. Not Visual Studio, but Visual Studio Code. This is the free version. You can download it on basically any system and use it. Now, this is incredibly popular for several reasons, one of them being that it has Git built into it, and I'll show you some of those changes that we mentioned a little bit ago. So make sure you download and install it, and you'll have something like this, right? So I've obviously been working in it a little bit, but that was really just as a placeholder for text. So now what we want to do is actually create our project in here. Now, you will notice a few other extensions on here that you won't have, and that's okay. You can just kind of ignore those for now because you won't really be using them in this series, although there are some really cool packages out there, and I would be really interested in covering them if you are. So let me know in the comments if that's the case. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and open up the Explorer here. Right? And we want to open up the folder that we're going to store this project in. Now, me personally, on my local machine, what I usually do is create a folder that's called dev. So inside of my hard drive, in the users, inside of my username, I create this folder called dev. This is true on my Mac as well as on my Windows, the exact same process. In the root user folder, inside of there, I put it in as dev. And so what we want to do here is we're going to go ahead and say, hello, Linode, and we'll go ahead and do fast API. So hello, Linode, fast API will be the name of this one. You can call it whatever you want, but that's the folder I'm going to store all of this in. And I'm going to go ahead and save this as basic notes inside of that folder so it doesn't remove it, right? So I probably will actually delete these at some point, but I'll go ahead and say delete-me.txt. Okay, because I actually don't want that file to end up being in public at all, especially mainly because of the password here. Okay, so now we have a folder that we want to track changes for. So what I'm going to do first is actually create a folder called HTML. This, of course, is going to be the HTML that is directly correlated to the HTML that's inside of our Nginx HTML, right? So all of this stuff that we did last time where we ended up deleting it. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and inside of this folder, I'm going to go ahead and call this index.html and paste that in there. You could totally call it the other name, right? So index and then Nginx Debian.html. So by all means, pick either name. It doesn't really matter. This is actually more to illustrate a purpose here. Okay, so I have two files in here now that I potentially might want to track. So the thing that we need to do now that hopefully by this time you have Git installed as well, I want to track the changes that happen to Nginx Debian. So to do this, we are going to go ahead and navigate to that file on our local machine. Okay, so I think this is maybe a little confusing because I have a couple terminal windows open here. So what we can actually do is use VS Code's terminal to actually work inside of the folder I need to work in. So VS Code's command line works with either Mac terminal, Linux terminal, or Windows PowerShell. So I can go into terminal and do new terminal here. And this is giving me the exact same terminal that the rest of my system has. And it's inside of the folder that I've been working in. This is also another nice thing about using VS Code is I don't actually have to worry about navigating in my terminal really ever. I just open up VS Code, that specific project, and then there we go. Okay, so now that I'm in this terminal, I want to do a couple things. First, what I want to do is the command of git init. So just like that, just git init empty. And notice that it actually creates an empty Git repository in that directory, right? So it actually is creating a folder in .git. To see that folder, we do ls-al. And if you're on Windows, I believe you would do dir. That should actually give you the same information, roughly speaking. And then we can see that there's .git here, and I can actually change into .git and see all other sorts of things. We will cover that in just a moment, but for now, I'll just stay in the root of my project where HTML and delete me-txt is. Now, another thing you would have noticed with VS Code is it is now giving me this error, and then there's all this green stuff going on. That is all version control related. So if I click on this source code thing, I can see that it says 2 pending changes. Like when I scroll over it, you should probably see that. And then what I see here is 2 different changes. Now, these are brand new files. So if I close out the terminal, which doesn't actually close it, just minimizes it, I can see that originally it had nothing and now it has something. So what I want to do is actually track this for changes. Now, VS Code has this built in again, but I'm going to show you how to do it in Git alone because Git itself is something you're going to want to know about, right? You're going to want to know how to actually these commands sort of work, even if you're not ready for like all out Git related things, which is totally fine. I think you certainly do not have to know everything about Git for it to be useful. All we've done so far is one single command, and that's initializing the folder or repository, the folder that we want to track. Like we want to track the changes to this particular folder. So what I want to do now is run something called git status. Now, git status is actually very similar to what we saw in this source control panel. It's just a little bit different. It's a little bit harder to understand what's going on. But the general rule of thumb is it's going to tell you when things have been added, that's also known as untracked, or when things have been changed or deleted. Right, so it's tracking what could happen to files. It's just the names of them are maybe a little tricky. So if we want to see the untracking or what happened, the difference between index.nginx-debian-or.html, we can do that. We can cd into HTML and do git status, and we can see in here that it's saying this entire folder does not have, or it has not been tracked. It's brand new. So what I want to do is I just want to add this particular file or maybe this entire folder. So let's cd back and I'll do git add HTML. So what this will do is it's going to add that entire file or folder. So whatever you write here, it's going to add to this tracking idea. And then we'll go ahead and do git commit and then add a message and say initial tracking of HTML. Now, this is actually important. We say add and then we say commit. Add is like getting it ready to be known by Git that we want to like monitor changes. And then git commit means, hey, we definitely want to monitor these changes or add these changes to the history of changes. So if I do that, now all I see in VS Code is the one single item of delete me in there. And if I do git status again, that's the only thing that shows up. This will be important in just a moment. So if I actually close out these files here with Command W or Control W, depending on what you're on, I just closed out those files. And now what I want to do is completely ignore this delete me file. Now to do this, we use something called a .git ignore file. So .git and then ignore, right? Really simple. Make sure you have that period there. Notice VS Code is already showing me that it is Git. That's the logo for Git. And so I can actually come in here and write out delete me.txt, save git ignore, and that becomes gray and it's no longer going to be tracked at all. So if I do git status, it's now not even considered by Git. And now that I've made that git ignore file, I can do git add.git ignore, git commit, and say added a git ignore file, and then there we go. Okay, so that stuff is kind of the basics of Git. If you want more in depth of that, please let me know in the comments, because there's a lot that we could cover with Git that isn't already some of the basics. So if you're a little bit more advanced and you've already done all these things, this is not hopefully for you. You probably skipped this section anyway. But the point is here, we now have some basic Git going. So let's see what happens when we make a change now. So I go into index.html or index.debian, this index.html file, and I'm going to bring back that color of green. Remember I said I wanted it to be red. So I bring that in, I save it, and I update this file. Now, when I say I update this file, I could have downloaded it from the internet, dragged it into this HTML folder, and then overwrite the changes. That actually would have been the same thing, right? So we can treat it as a brand new file if we wanted to. And I would recommend that you try that out. But at this point, it's now a yellow color in VS Code. And if we do git status, we should now see that, hey, this has been modified, right? So how has this been modified? Well, if I copy this and do git diff and paste that in and hit enter, I now see that, hey, look, it added green in here, right? What if I actually removed the width and saved that? And then again, git diff, it will show me these differences, right? It shows me red, that was removed, and this was added. So the coolest thing about this is I can now see, here's the changes. Here's where we're at with this new code, right? And VS Code, of course, has these things in here built in. And if we look at it, I can actually see that right here, right? So it's actually showing me this was removed, this was added. So the left is going to be the original, the source, and then on the right, that's the new stuff. Okay, so without getting too much more into Git, the general idea here is it's now tracking these changes over time. But every time we make a change, we actually have to let Git know that it's a change that we actually want, right? So in the case of this green color with the width gone, I don't want that change. So if I go into git status, I can actually do git reset, and that will potentially reset all of my changes. Now, in this case, it actually didn't do it right away. So I can do git reset -- hard, and that will immediately make those changes. Now, this is good and bad, and there's a lot of things that we could talk about here. But again, we don't want to get too much into Git. I just want to give you some of the basics that I use all of the time. So first off, it's git init to create a repo, and then git status to see the status of where I am. And then if I make changes, I do git add that file. So in the case of this one, I'll go ahead and do color being red again. And now I'll go ahead and do git add, or let's do git status to see what has changed, and there it is. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the name of that and do git add. That's the file that has changed, and then I'll do git commit, and then message being added red color, and there we go, right? So it now actually is tracking that, and we can actually verify this by, again, doing git status. Nothing has changed. We're good. And we can also do git log, and we can also see a log of all of those changes. Now we can also see the differences in these things over time, but very often, especially when I'm working on my own project, it's rare that I'll do git diff if I'm doing all of it myself. Sometimes I do, but it doesn't happen that often. But git diff itself will also tell you all the differences that have happened on the entire repository. So that's another really good little sign to play around with. So this is just some Git basics, so we can now actually set all of this up on our server and be able to move things around in there. And I think you'll probably learn a couple new commands in there as well. All right, so now it's time to install Git on our server. So what we're doing here is we're going to set up a remote repository on our server. So what we had so far in our local environment is we have a local repository. Now we need one on our server, and that's just called a remote repository. So let's go ahead and SSH into our server. Now, I don't remember the name of it, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump back into Linode and grab the root access here. We want to use root access for this at this point, and I'm going to go ahead and SSH in to that root user with the password that I have saved, and there we go. Okay, cool. So I'm now in that remote user. So sudo apt get update, hit enter, and we always want to run update before we are about to install something, just to ensure that our system is as up to date as it can be as far as what we can install. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and do sudo apt get install, now git, Git, and -y to just accept the additional storage capacity that it needs. Okay, so now it's downloaded and it's installed. So one of the things that I want to run right off the bat is git config --global, and we'll do init.default branch being main. So I didn't go into this in the basics, but the branches, one of the cool things about Git as well is you can make something called different branches. To me, these are like different timelines that your code could be. If you watched Avengers Endgame, you're like making these little branches in time that could then merge back into the primary branch, which in this case is main. It used to be master, but Git changed it to main. Anyways, so this can be verified on our local system as well as being main, and I think the vast majority of them are going to be main. But if you see master here and you just want to stick with that, that's okay too, but do keep in mind that you might be on different branches, and that's a whole nother layer of complexity related to Git that we're just not going to get into right now. Okay, so what we have here is inside of var and ww, or let's just go into the var folder. Again, I'm in an SSH session, so I have a session and I do have this folder called www-git. So that's the folder we want to go into here. So I'm going to cd into www-git, and this is actually where I'm going to go ahead and create my repo for my local project, right? So I don't actually have a great name for this local project, so I'm just going to stick with Hello Linode Fast API. So to do this, we're first going to make a directory called hello-linode-fastapi.git. Now I use .git as a signal to myself that this is a Git folder. It's possible that you would do this elsewhere, but it's a specific kind of Git folder. It's not the same as the one that's local. So if I hit enter and cd into that, so let's change into that. This of course is just an empty folder right now. What I need to do is I need to turn it into what's called a bare repository. So I'm going to go ahead and do git init and then --bare. Now before, what I did was just simply git init, and that created my local repository. Git init --bare is a little bit different. If I hit enter and list things out in here, I now see things that are related to Git only. It's not in the .git actual folder, right? So if I list everything out, I don't see .git in here, but rather I see all of these other things that are related to this. So I now actually have a production ready hosted folder, or almost hosted folder, and I just need to actually have my code come in here. Like I need to actually set it up to where my local machine can actually push code in here. So that is what I want to do now. So I'll leave that SSH session going, and I'll open up a new terminal window just by pressing down here on these tabs or this plus sign. If you press down here, you can actually pick different terminals, or you can just press plus and it will actually give you a brand new terminal, and you can throw it away with this trash sign if you wanted to kill that active terminal. And that's true with the SSH too. So just think of it as like closing the window, if you will. You can also split it too, which gives you another terminal in that same thing. And to close any one out, you just want to click in that one and hit close, and that will delete it or shut it down. Okay, so now back into my local repository or my local project folder, I do ls-all. And again, I see Git in here. So now what I want to do is create a remote. So I actually want to set up this to use SSH and send it into production. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a git remote by doing git remote add. So this command is very, very common. So if you were using GitHub, you might put it in as GitHub. GitHub often says origin. That's usually how they denote the remote for GitHub. But it's also true for like your basic, where you're going to be storing all of this code in the first place. But in my case, I'm going to go ahead and say git remote add Linode, and then I'm going to use // So this signifies to Git that we are using an SSH connection. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use that user I created. So if you didn't create a user, you definitely should now. So it's CFE at, and then the IP address that we have for this, in this case, is this one right here. And then I'll go ahead and paste this in. Now, I will stop for a moment and say that if you actually set up your system a little bit differently, you don't have to use IP addresses here, but we're going to do that because we haven't set it up differently. That's pretty much it. There is an option for that down the line. So after we got that, we do a colon here and do /var/www-git/ well, really what I'm trying to do here is actually go to this location right here. Notice that the command line inside of my SSH session is essentially showing me what I want to put here, with the exception that this says localhost on this location instead of the actual IP address. So again, I'll go ahead and copy this folder right here and paste it in right like that. And then that is actually going to be where I send this repository. So I hit enter, and now I actually have a remote host for my Git code, which I think is actually really, really cool. So what I can do now is I can actually do git push Linode, and then the branch I want to push, which is main. Okay. So at this point, it actually failed to accept this. The remote did not allow for this to happen, which is possible for many different reasons. So we will address that in just a little bit. But for now, the idea is if we do git remote and -v verbose, it should actually show us the correct location for everything, which is great. All right, so we left it off where if I try to push this code, I get this error that it cannot push these references to that host. And it is saying what the error is. It's unable to create a temporary object directory. Now, to me, I see unable to create. Now, this is likely a permissions error. I know this from using these things from time to time, but also if we think back to how we created this directory in the first place, well, it's not that hard to realize I actually used the root user, which often means that we're going to have permissions errors. So even inside of this project here, I see that that's actually where I created this folder. So all I'm going to do is remove it. So remove that folder. Oops, not the git command, but rather the folder itself. And we will now exit out of this session and log in with our CFE user or the other actual username that we created. And now again, we will go ahead and create this folder. We'll cd into var www-git, and we see it in here. I'm going to go ahead and make that directory again, cd into that directory, git init, and --bear all over again. So now I actually have hopefully have the correct permissions necessary to do this push. I should have it because of how I'm actually logging in locally too. Because again, if we do git remote -v, I see that it's the CFE user that is moving in here. So when I do a push now, I shouldn't have permissions errors because that's the user who actually owns it. Now, there's a lot of things we can go into to actually make sure that that happened originally, but I didn't want to spend too much time with permissions themselves. So anyway, so now we can actually push it into our actual remote user right here, which is great. But where is it? Right? So what we actually need to do is one more step, and that is we need to have the ability to set up the actual Git repository on our production server, as well as where this should be unloaded into, as in where do I actually copy the files from this repository to? Like, where do I have that working production, data. And we actually already have that answer to some degree, and that is in var www. Because if you remember var www, if we change into there, we already have that HTML folder, and that HTML folder does have this Nginx stuff in here. So that's where we're going to want to put it. We're going to send it to this folder right here. So let's go ahead and do that in a way that makes sense. First of all, we're going to go ahead and go back into our production Git repo, and that's this right here. And we're going to navigate into something called hooks. So what you can do with Git is you can use all kinds of hooks that are related to this repository. So the one we're going to use is the post receive hook. But there are a bunch of samples of different kinds of hooks that you might want to use, right? So like locally, perhaps I want a pre-push hook that is run right before I actually call this push command. Like it happens before anything else happens and could potentially prevent a proper push into production. So yeah, Git is a tool that's really useful, but again, it can be incredibly complicated. So let's try to make it as straightforward as possible. And so we're going to create a post receive hook, which is really just a script. We can do all sorts of really interesting things with this. And just keep in mind that it's just a script. It's just another thing that we can execute on here. So it could be a Python script, it can be a Ruby script, it can be a Bash script, it can be a lot of different scripts that might be installed on your local machine or the production machine, either one. Okay, so in here with these hooks, let's go ahead and create the actual file necessary, which is the post receive hook file. And to do this, we're just going to go ahead and do touch post receive. Now it's critical that you put this in the same place as all of these other hooks, right? That's actually where it has to be, and that's where we put it. And then it's also critical that we make it executable, at least for this user. So chmod plus x post receive. Notice that I'm not using sudo at all. I shouldn't have to use sudo based off of the permissions we made a long ago. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go ahead and do nano. Let's actually change this post receive hook to be able to handle the changes that might happen. Now the first thing I need to put in here is I need to declare that it is a bash script. That is like a command line script. So my machine will know to run this as a bash script as opposed to something like a Python script or something like that. So we just come in as bin/bash, just like that, with hashtag and exclamation mark, just like that. Okay, so what it is that we want to do is we want to do git and then the, basically the destination and then the source. That's not how it's named, but those are the things that we're wanting to do. And then we want to check out the main branch. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and force it. Okay, so what is the source first? What is the actual name for it? And that is git-dir. And that is going to be var and www-git, and then the name of the repo itself, which is this right here. It's that entire thing, right? So I just need the name of the repo at this point, but we'll bring that one in and paste that there. And checkout main is that main branch, those branches that I talked about. I just want to declare, hey, let's make sure that we're checking out that specific branch. And I mentioned before, if for some reason you're using the master branch or a different branch altogether, you could change that right here. And I use -F just to force this from happening. Now, if you know of a more elegant way to do this, please let me know. I would love to check it out. But this is the one I've used for a long time, and it seems to be really effective. Okay, so the destination is the next part we want to worry about, and that is going to be our work tree. And we're going to set this equal to var/www. Now I'm putting it in the root of www, but it's possible that you would have it not in this root. I just think, well, it makes sense to put it in the root at this point because of where this folder is. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and do Control X, Y, and then enter. Now we have that post receive hook. So I should, in theory, be able to run it, right? I should, in theory, be able to run it because I've already done a successful push. If I try to push again, it shows me everything is up to date. So let's actually run this post receive hook with // and post receive. And notice it says it's switched to branch main. And if I do it again, it's probably, oops, I don't need to press up. Let's try that again. We can also run bash and then calling post receive, and it tells me already on main. So at this point, I actually probably could nano back into post receive and get rid of the main portion, right? I don't actually need to change main any longer. Okay, I probably just needed to do that once, and then again, I can run bash and post receive, and it should have worked. Okay, so now is the big one. How do we actually test that it worked? Well, it has to do with making changes. So I'm going to change these to, like, I think it was at 35. I'm going to leave it back at 35. I'm going to get rid of this color, and then I'll just go ahead and say, hello, Git world, this is Linode on my local machine. And now I'll go ahead and do git status, and I see that there's some changes. So I can do git add period. That actually adds all of the things that have changed. And then I'll do git commit and add a message and say something like, Git is now working, ? And then git push origin main, hit enter. And of course, that's not the actual repository. This is just a habit that I have. It's actually git push Linode main. That is the name of the remote and the branch that we want to send, which is main. I hit enter, and now it pushes it. It doesn't seem like there are any errors, but what we need to do now is actually go to our host and take a look. And what do you know? Hello, Git world. This is a Linode. So it's fully working, and that's awesome. And of course, this is only for static files at this point, but it's for any of these files. The configuration that we're going to need to change once we're ready is just Nginx. We just need to run something different with Nginx and perhaps change our actual Git receiver hook just slightly as well. We're not going to do that just yet, but at this point, we've made some pretty great progress. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this one. And of course, if you have any questions whatsoever, the Linode support team is happy to help. So be sure to comment below with those questions or anything else. And of course, if you want to see other kinds of series, please let us know. And if you did like this, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button and subscribe so you can see future videos. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.